Philosophers talk to our times towards an ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. I know I keep on coming back to that in this series. I think it's the second time I've done it. This problem, a problem for me that Hannah Arendt puts very clearly in the danger of manufacturing the mass, by which she defines as that group of people who are understood by society and are understood by society as being somehow surplus, that they could be got rid of and nobody'd notice. Now, that has of course been the politics of all my life. Certainly all my comfortably remembered political life. I can remember Sonny Jim quite happily. But really, my politics and my awareness of the political world started with Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher in England was more than comfortable in manufacturing a mass. That was what it meant to break the post-war consensus, the post-war fear that Hannah Arendt put in the heart of all leaders, that once you create a group of people, a lumpen proletariat, that knew they no longer mattered to society, then that group of people would have no other option than to dream of that society as being somehow smashed, got rid of, so that they again mattered. The group was very dangerous. So you didn't want to manufacture them. Except Thatcher did. Did it very deliberately, didn't care. And then used the entire organisation of the state against this group as if they were already smashing the system. It was kind of one of those beautiful double folds. So you create a group whose logic would be to attack that which is disadvantaging them and query the entire system. And then that gives you an excuse in the name of the system to attack them. And you create a sort of that's why a whole generation will think of Margaret Thatcher as fascist. And we'll look at the politics of the modern fascists and go, well, they're just Thatcher's children. Farage is just a Thatcher. And that is a bit right. It's slightly different now, but it is a bit right. She certainly was very happy to use the engines of the state to crush, as if they were rebels, those who she had deliberately thrown out of society, or the economic society anyway. But that created then this group of folks who then had a subculture, because that was how they responded, by creating a culture of their own, a religion perhaps of the weak, as witchcraft was once said to be the witchcraft of the weak. With its set of rules that were quite intoxicating and quite different, and will mean that all these years later I can sing a whole set of songs and can feel myself part of this group perfectly happily. But it also created something that had never existed before. It created long-term masses, long-term sets of people whose entire politics was defined by the fact that they were somehow thrown out of, no longer part of, the overall system. And so that their logic, their first move would be, let's smash the state and start again. And one of the curious things, and it's genuinely curious, is here we are 40, 50 years later, and there's very few people who I feel don't belong to a Hannah Arendt mass. Oh, they're no longer the same masses. And it is absolutely clear that there are engines, different mass-creating engines. I suppose like they create little abscesses within the system. Because, of course, once you create a mass who self-define themselves as somehow not reachable by politicians, not reachable by society, creates a subculture that is deliberately not reachable by society, and therefore feel they have no interest in trusting that society, or believing anything ultimately that it says, you create a political force. You create a group of people who you can guarantee, if you can represent them, will support you and not be too questioning, simply because they've undermined all the normal criteria with which the society in which they were initially born understands truth or lies or what in fact good governance looks like. Because once you join the mass, the notion of good mass government simply goes out the window. You are no longer that group that is governed for. You're the natural born rebels, us. And once you truly rebel, then you are truly outside the system from which you rebel. Otherwise, you're just a protester. Doesn't matter how you dress it up. And if you're just a protester, that's a very different thing, because you're a lobby group, ultimately. And within lobbying, people matter, but also money matters. And now, the suppression that then creates, and you can see it there, this kind of complexity, because it also creates a society which engineers masses in the sense that they will treat all protest as if it was already either mass, so potential rebellion, or a lobby group, and therefore part of a corrupt system. An actual protest almost gets stymied by the system. But so great has the notion of mass seeped into society that I know, as I think I said, apart from my ma, almost nobody who would be comfortable not being part of a mass, not being part of a group. Okay, I live in the paranoid region of France, up in the mountains. Everybody's paranoid here. That's why they're here in the mountains. They all feel themselves as somehow rebels, outside society, forgotten by the centre, somehow marooned, with no real interest. But that's here, that's where it's always been. But now in urban cities everywhere, that notion that somehow the majority of the population has been abandoned, left out, and AI and the entire logic of AI simply intensifies it, so superfluous, is everywhere. And of course, the problem is that once it is everywhere, once it becomes a subculture, then the Hannah Arendt rule no longer really applies. In her world, that group was created. It was created by an economic reality. It wasn't a cultural reality. It was created at one particular time, in the near collapse of the Weimar Republic. And that then created a potential recruiting army. Or in the near collapse of Russia in the end of the First World War. That created a potential revolutionary army. And that was why she thought it was so different. But in our modern incarnation, it is created through cultural collapse. It's created by, yes, hugely economically disadvantaging groups of people, which in the post-Thatcherite society, that is a society that doesn't care about internal unity, in spite of what it says, in spite of how it might mince around or understand its any sort of cultural unity as merely the hegemony of the middle classes, which is really what Blair meant by it. We're all going to be middle class. We're all going to be, I used to be able to do him, we'll all be middle class now, whether we like it or not. So in that society, anything that is at all other will automatically be caught up in a logic of the mass. They'll see themselves as somehow external to the entire state, as surplus to it. I mean, on my side, the entire argument about billionaires. We all blame billionaires now. Is it the richest 30 or the richest 1%? I can't lose count. Are guilty for everything. Well, I guess it's better than blaming the pensioners, which used to be the option. You'll most notice I have a certain level of cynicism. I have no doubt that arses like Thiel and, oh God, Musk, the most indebted man in the world, are absolute turds who pull the political system and lobby to the point of imbecility and are driving us towards universal Armageddon. I have no doubt about that. But it is more complicated than just blaming them. If we simply guillotined the lot of them, it wouldn't actually help very much. It wouldn't change the system that made them. It wouldn't change what they were or how they became. It would ultimately do no good. But the logic of blaming that group of people, saying they're the only ones that matter in the state, is a logic that creates everybody else now is the mass. We all feel ourselves outside the state. That's why, of course, we're all... and you can see it. You can see it in the lack of good news stories. So here in France, there were, as you will all know, huge fires. Huge fires that threatened Bordeaux. So what's that, the fourth biggest city in France? I can't remember what the fourth biggest is. But one of the biggest cities. It is unthinkable that Bordeaux burns down, as unthinkable as in Britain as Bristol burnt down. Or I suppose in America, I don't know what the equivalent would be, Detroit, that sort of size, simply burnt down. It was unthinkable, but it almost happened. But then the winds changed, there was a bit of rain, and it didn't happen. And yet we still get people in England worrying about us. Why? Oh, because good news doesn't sell newspapers and good news doesn't create mass. The point is that you don't quite hear the good news. Likewise with data centers. Now, I am opposed to data centers because they clearly are a power grab and they clearly are an unnecessary flirt of capitalism. And anyway, I'm not very partial to AI. So I don't like the massive pulling out of data centers. But whether they'll all be built or whether they're all part of a stock market bubble, that's a very different question. But again, my bit of the left is being stirred up in a hymn of hatred against them to make sure that they're never built. And also to make sure that we all feel ourselves somehow separate from the state that could even dream of building them. So our ethic of we must smash the state to stop this remains true and golden pure. And so we tend to forget the sheer complexities of what is actually happening here. We simply see it as that all these centres will be built. Well, maybe. All of them as if they have already been financed. Well, maybe. Our state has betrayed us by wanting them. Well, maybe. And I would put all of those in the maybe category, personally, if I'm actually thinking about it with my logical hat on, because there's all sorts of things I don't know. But that's not the point. It's being sold as a story to generate a minority, or a group that feels themselves the minority, but actually are the majority. An en masse who feel themselves disfranchised, who look at political parties and say, we want none of them, we want to just smash the state. So we'll either vote very far right, or we'll vote what gets called far left, which actually isn't far left, but never mind. Because the entire ethic becomes about a state that seems to want to destroy itself. And this is, as I would always say at this point, absolutely ironic, because there are real pressing dangers. The inability of governments to handle environmental meltdown, which is an inability that we're all complicit in, all of us who drive, all of us who eat, and therefore are eating non-organic anyway. It's very hard, I think, to escape, I think is what I would say, the complicity of it. And simply saying, well, I'm going to do my best, I'm going to drop out, simply makes you into another mass. Rather, what we actually all have to do is accept collective responsibility and act accordingly. In a sense, the reason why the mass movement is so dangerous is that at no other time in human history have we needed effective government more truly than we need it now. I mean it. We need actually effective managerial government that's capable of organising everybody and keeping everybody on board and keeping everybody included. Just as we've moved to an entire politics of us understanding ourselves as part of a mass and therefore external to the system and immune to government. I mean, the only conditions you would need government more was in a genuine epidemic or a war. But even then, probably not so much, because both of those can be solved or you'll all die. This is a long-term managerial problem. And so, if I had to put my finger on what is the biggest problem poisoning our minds, it is our reluctance to understand ourselves to be citizens as part of a state. We like the glamour of being en masse. And that glamour, with its complacent ability to say, well, I'm looking after myself, I'm doing what I can. Or that's on the left. Or on the right, just the fear of something that is not to be feared. Immigrants, I mean. And is blinding us to what we actually have to do, which is to just to knuckle under, make sure that we have a government capable of acting on the world in the circumstances that we find ourselves and helping us survive the next few years. Oh yes, I'd love a violent revolution. I'd love to change the world and make it communist. Of course I would. But I also accept realpolitik. Actually, just surviving would be nice. And surviving with a world relatively intact. And if to do that I have to support a government capable of managing the world as it is, I'd probably do that perfectly happily. The irony is, I think most of us would. I think most of us would support a government that was allowed to be competent. That we give up our addiction to mass. The problem is, how do we get to that point? How do we demand that we're so hooked on our addiction to being en masse, and it's so useful to so many political parties who are not interested in serious government? It becomes very difficult to understand how we will move to where we actually have to move, which is competent executives capable of managing emotions. But if we don't do that, my God, we're screwed.